The Elephant Island Chronicles presents The Quiet Feast by Conrad Hannon. Narration by 11 Labs. Part 1. The Invitation. It was a day like any other in the Kingdom of Solitude, a land shrouded in perpetual twilight, where the sun never fully committed to rising or setting. In a small, unremarkable cottage on the outskirts of the capital, an introvert named Harold sat alone in his dimly lit parlor, staring at the calendar on the wall. The date was circled in red ink, a glaring reminder of the day he had been dreading, his birthday. Birthdays were peculiar affairs in Solitude. Unlike in other lands where such days were marked by joyous celebrations, laughter, and the company of loved ones, birthdays were an obligation in Solitude, a rite of passage that one could not escape. The law of the land, dictated by the tyrannical King Noise, required that every citizen host a feast on their birthday. Invitations had to be sent, guests had to be entertained, and merriment had to be had, whether one desired it or not. For Harold, this was nothing short of torture. He had spent his life carefully cultivating his solitude, meticulously avoiding the prying eyes and intrusive conversations of his neighbors. His small cottage, with its thick stone walls and heavy curtains, was his sanctuary, where he could think, read, and exist without the constant din of social interaction. The thought of opening his doors to others, of being forced to engage in banal chatter and forced pleasantries, filled him with dread. Yet the law was the law. And so, with a heavy heart and trembling hands, Harold set about preparing for the inevitable. He began by drafting the invitations, each word carefully chosen to minimize the likelihood of acceptance. "Your presence is requested," he wrote, "at a modest gathering to mark the passing of another year. Food will be served, but conversation is not encouraged." He hoped that the terse, uninviting tone would deter the recipients, but he knew hope was fragile in Solitude. The invitations were sent, and Harold waited. Days passed in anxious anticipation, each knock at the door or rustle of the wind causing his heart to skip a beat. Finally, the replies began to arrive, each one more dreadful than the last. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," wrote Mrs. Chatterbox, a widow known for her endless stories about her late husband's bowel movements. "I look forward to discussing the latest village gossip," penned Mr. Gossipmonger, whose sole purpose in life seemed to be the dissemination of trivial and often scandalous news. Even the notorious Sir Boreal, a man whose every sentence was a lecture on crop rotation, responded enthusiastically, "Count me in." Harold's heart sank with each acceptance. Despite his best efforts, it seemed that his birthday feast would be attended by the very people he had spent his life avoiding. Part 2. The Preparations. As the fateful day approached, Harold found himself consumed by preparations. The laws of Solitude were strict, and failure to comply with the king's mandates could result in severe punishment. The feast had to be grand, the table laden with delicacies, the wine flowing freely. Yet Harold's culinary skills were as limited as his desire for company. He settled on a simple menu: bread, cheese, and wine. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate, just enough to meet the bare minimum requirements of the law. The decorations were equally sparse. A single candle in the center of the table, its flickering flame casting long shadows on the walls, was the only concession to festivity. Harold hoped that the gloom would deter his guests from lingering too long, but deep down, he knew that it was a futile hope. The day of the feast arrived, with it, a sense of impending doom. Harold dressed in his finest, though still plain, attire, and took his place at the head of the table. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence, each passing second bringing him closer to the inevitable. At last, the doorbell rang, its shrill chime echoing through the empty house. Harold rose slowly, his legs trembling beneath him, and made his way to the door. As he opened it, the sight that greeted him was enough to make his blood run cold. There, standing on his doorstep, were his guests. Mrs. Chatterbox, Mr. Gossipmonger, Sir Boreal, and a dozen others, all dressed in their finest clothes, their faces alight with anticipation. They pushed past him, chattering and laughing, filling the small cottage with a cacophony of noise that made Harold's head spin. The feast had begun. Part 3. The Feast. Once so simple and understated, the table now seemed to groan under the weight of the guests' demands. Plates were filled and refilled, goblets were drained and replenished, and all the while, the conversation flowed like a never-ending river of drivel. Mrs. Chatterbox regaled the table with tales of her late husband's digestive woes, her voice rising and falling with dramatic flair. Mr. Gossipmonger eagerly shared the latest scandal involving the baker's daughter and the blacksmith's apprentice, his eyes gleaming with malice. Sir Boreal droned on about the merits of crop rotation, his voice a monotonous drone that threatened to lull Harold into a state of catatonia. Harold, trapped at the head of the table, felt as though he were drowning in a sea of words. Each sentence, each laugh, each clink of glass was like a nail being driven into his skull. He longed to flee, to escape to the quiet sanctuary of his bedroom. But he knew that such a retreat would only invite further scrutiny and gossip. As the hours dragged on, Harold's mind began to unravel. The noise, the chaos, the sheer assault on his senses was too much. He felt as though he were being slowly suffocated, each breath a struggle against the oppressive atmosphere. His hands clenched into fists under the table, his knuckles white with tension. And then, in a moment of desperation, Harold did something he had never done before. He spoke. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking with the force of the outburst. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to him in shock. Harold, usually quiet and reserved, had never raised his voice in all the years his neighbors had known him. The silence was deafening. For a moment, Harold felt a flicker of hope, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could regain control of the situation. But that hope was quickly dashed. Mrs. Chatterbox, her eyes wide with surprise, recovered first. "Oh, Harold!" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with false concern. "We didn't mean to upset you. We're just here to celebrate your special day." "Yes," chimed in Mr. Gossipmonger, his tone patronizing. "You should be grateful to have so many friends who care about you." Harold's temper flared, but before he could respond, Sir Boreal leaned forward, his expression grave. "Perhaps what Harold needs is a distraction," he suggested. "Something to take his mind off the noise." The others nodded in agreement, and before Harold could protest, they began to offer suggestions. "A game of charades," cried Mrs. Chatterbox. "A sing-along," suggested Mr. Gossipmonger. "Perhaps a lecture on the benefits of crop rotation?" Sir Boreal offered, his eyes glinting with enthusiasm. Harold's stomach churned at the thought of enduring any of these activities. But the laws of solitude were clear. The host was required to entertain his guests. And so, with a heavy heart, Harold agreed. The night dragged on, each moment more unbearable than the last. The guests, emboldened by Harold's acquiescence, grew louder and more boisterous, their laughter echoing through the small cottage like the cackling of demons. The games were torturous, the sing-along a cacophony of off-key voices, and Sir Boreal's lecture was as dry and tedious as ever. By the time the clock struck midnight, Harold was a broken man. His nerves were frayed, and his mind shattered by the relentless onslaught of noise and chaos. He could barely remember a time when his cottage had been quiet, when his thoughts had been his own. As the guests finally began to take their leave, each offering insincere thanks for a wonderful evening, Harold could only nod numbly. He stood in the doorway, watching as they disappeared into the night, their voices fading into the distance. When the last guest had gone, Harold closed the door and leaned against it, his body trembling with exhaustion. The cottage, once again empty and silent, felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the stench of spilled wine and half-eaten food, the remnants of a feast that had been anything but celebratory. Harold stumbled to the table, his legs barely able to support him. The candle in the center had burned to a nub, its flame flickering weakly. He stared at it, his eyes unfocused, his mind numb. At that moment, Harold realized something that filled him with a cold, hollow despair. He had survived the feast, yes, but at what cost? His sanctuary had been violated, his solitude shattered, his soul crushed under his guests' demands. And worst of all, he knew that it would happen again. Next year the cycle would repeat, the feast would be held, and the guests would return. There was no escape, no reprieve from the tyranny of social obligation. With a trembling hand, Harold reached for the candle, his fingers brushing against the hot wax. He extinguished the flame with a single breath, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, he stood there, listening to the silence. It was an oppressive, suffocating reminder of the emptiness that filled his life. The darkness was not the comforting shroud he had once known, but a void that echoed with the ghosts of his unwanted guests. Harold turned and made his way to his bedroom, each step heavier than the last. As he lay down on his bed, he felt as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him, crushing him into the mattress. His eyes closed, but sleep did not come. Instead, his mind raced with thoughts of the feast, the noise, and the endless cycle of birthdays that stretched before him like a prison sentence. There was no escape, no way to reclaim the solitude he had once cherished. In the darkness, Harold began to weep, silent, racking sobs that shook his frail body. The tears flowed freely, soaking the pillow beneath his head, a bitter release for a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. And in that moment, Harold made a decision. Part 4. The Escape. The next morning, the sun, such as it was in solitude, rose to find Harold's cottage empty. The door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze, and inside, the remnants of the feast lay untouched, as if frozen in time. The villagers, curious as ever, soon noticed Harold's absence and gathered outside his home, whispering amongst themselves. "Where could he have gone?" asked Mrs. Chatterbox, her voice tinged with genuine concern for the first time in years. "Maybe he went for a walk," suggested Mr. Gossipmonger, though he didn't sound convinced. Harold had never been one for walks, but Sir Boreal, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "No," he said gravely. "Harold would never leave without good reason." As the villagers debated Harold's fate, one among them, a young boy no older than 10, slipped away from the group and entered the cottage. He wandered through the silent rooms, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The boy had always been curious about Harold, about the man who lived alone and never seemed to need anyone. In the bedroom, the boy found a letter on the pillow, addressed simply to the people of Solitude. With trembling hands, he picked it up and began to read. "To my fellow citizens," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. Do not search for me, for I have left Solitude behind in search of a place where I can truly be alone. A place where the noise of the world cannot reach me, where the demands of others will no longer weigh upon my soul. I have spent my life in quiet contemplation, cherishing the solitude that I believed was my right as an individual. But the laws of our land have made it impossible for me to live as I wish. Birthdays, once a day of personal reflection, have become a nightmare of forced interaction and hollow pleasantries. I can no longer endure the feast, the noise, the endless chatter that drowns out my thoughts. And so, I have made the only choice left to me. I have left Solitude, seeking a place where my soul can find peace. Do not mourn for me, for I am finally free. Yours in solitude, Harold. The boy finished reading and looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. He hurried back outside to the waiting villagers, the letter clutched tightly in his hands. As he read the letter aloud, a hush fell over the crowd. Mrs. Chatterbox was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. He left because of us? Sir Boreal frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. Perhaps we were too demanding, he admitted, too insistent on imposing our ways on him. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wondering if they had played a role in driving Harold away. It was an uncomfortable thought, one that gnawed at the edges of their consciences. But Mr. Gossipmonger, ever the contrarian, shook his head. Nonsense, he declared. Harold was always strange. He never fit in. It's not our fault he couldn't handle a little company. The crowd murmured in agreement, but the unease lingered. Deep down, they all knew that something had changed. Harold's departure was a sign, a warning that perhaps the ways of solitude were not as perfect as they had always believed. As the villagers slowly dispersed, the boy remained behind, staring at the empty cottage. He thought about Harold, about the loneliness that had driven him away, and he felt a pang of guilt. In a way, he had always admired Harold, admired his ability to be alone and content. Now that admiration had turned to something darker, a realization that maybe, just maybe, solitude was not the blessing he had once thought it to be. The boy turned and walked away, leaving the cottage to the ravages of time. The wind whispered through the open door, carrying with it the faintest echo of Harold's final words. I am finally free. But in solitude, freedom was a fleeting thing, as elusive as the sun that never truly rose. The villagers would move on, the laws would remain unchanged, and another introvert would one day be forced to host a feast in Harold's place. The cycle would continue, as it always had, and the quiet rebellion of one man would be forgotten, buried beneath the weight of tradition and obligation. For in solitude, the greatest crime was not the breaking of laws, but the breaking of silence. The end. From all of us here at the Elephant Island Chronicles, we hope you have enjoyed this original short story by Conrad Hannon. Until next time, stay gruntled.